Thank you very much. Now, it is widely accepted that human trafficking constitutes a violation of human rights. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes reports that it affects almost every country in the world, Ghana, my home country, being no exception. In the case of Rantsov, Cyprus, and Russia, it's a case decided by the European Court of Human Rights. The court stated that, and I quote, "There can be no doubt that trafficking threatens the human dignity and fundamental freedoms of its victims and cannot be considered compatible with a democratic society and the values expounded in the convention," unquote. Now, this statement underscores the seriousness attached to this practice, and it is for this reason that it constitutes a serious offense in Ghana. In Ghana, it is a second-degree felony. I have, in my original presentation, I have footnoted all these statements, which I didn't put, so the footnotes are there in the presentation, which I am sure will be published. A report, the law in Ghana against combating human trafficking is the Human Trafficking Act of 2005, and it defines human trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, trading, or receipt of persons for the purpose of exploitation within and across national borders by use of threats, force, or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, the abuse of power or exploitation of vulnerability, or giving or receiving payments and benefits to receive consent. Exploitation includes, at the minimum, induced prostitution and other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs or the placement for sale, bonded placements, temporary placements, placement as service where exploitation by someone else is the motivating factor. Ghana is seen as a source, transit, and destination country, though the perception is that domestic trafficking in humans is more prevalent than in the international or the transnational trafficking. This perception may be due to the fact that culturally and historically, children especially have been sent to live with other families. They may be relatives or not, mostly due to the inability of parents to take care of these children due to poverty. I must state, though, that on my time on the bench, when I dealt with human trafficking cases, more transnational cases involving human trafficking were prosecuted before me than domestic cases. In the only domestic case I recall adjudicating on, the charges could not be proven, hence it failed. One report, and this is the US Department of State report for 2016 on human trafficking in Ghana, has identified that Ghanaian children in particular are exploited and subjected to forced labor such as fishing, domestic service, street hawking, begging, artisanal mining, and providing labor in agricultural enterprises. The report also stated that girls are subjected to sex trafficking, mostly prevalent in the Volta and western regions of the country, though it exists nationwide. With the practice of the transnational human trafficking in persons, all forms of promises are made to the victims, mostly bordering on financial and economic gain. The driving force behind the gullibility of these victims happen to be poverty. In their desire to escape the grinding poverty they find themselves in and to forge a better life for themselves and their families, these victims fall prey to unscrupulous persons who end up trafficking them. In cases I dealt with in the Gender and Domestic Violence Court, I realized the trend where most of the victims who were trafficked were from the Delta states in Nigeria. I'm sorry, Nigerians. Any person familiar with Nigeria will recognize Delta State as one of the oil-rich states in Nigeria. But despite the oil wealth, majority of the citizens live in abject poverty. They are promised well-paying jobs in the Middle and Far East and told they would have to transit through Ghana. It, however, turns out to be a different story when they arrive in Ghana. They are trafficked as sex slaves and put to work as sex workers, with no remuneration at all and just enough food for sustenance. Some of these victims were also trafficked from as far as Vietnam and Cambodia. Again, they were promised well-paying jobs in Europe, but were trafficked into the sex trade on arrival in Ghana. A giant step taken in the fight against human trafficking in Ghana was the enactment of the Human Trafficking Act, which I've already mentioned. The enactment provides the legal basis for the prosecution of the offense and institution of sanctions where appropriate. The legislative instrument accompanying the Act, the LI 2219, has also been passed about 2 years ago. The passage of this LI is a significant progress in the fight against human trafficking, as the failure to draft and enact it over the years after the passage of the law had been one of the shortcomings in the implementation of the Parent Act. This is because the passage of these regulations strengthens the Parent Act by standardizing the procedures to be adopted under the Act by the various agencies designated to help combat this practice. The police service also has a dedicated unit, which is the Anti-Human Trafficking Unit. This is the unit clothed with the responsibility of investigating and prosecuting allegations of human trafficking offenses. Further, the Ghana Immigration Service also has a unit set up to train officials of the service on how to detect cases of trafficking and smuggling of persons. This unit is also tasked with investigating and arrest of suspected offenders. Even with all the significant achievements chalked in combating human trafficking, there still remains hurdles to overcome. Unfortunately, in Ghana, there's a dearth of statistical information from the various agencies on the exact arrests and prosecutions from human trafficking. I would therefore be unable to cite any reliable data in this regard. I am, however, aware that some successes have been chalked in the area of arrest and prosecutions. Given the pervasive nature of the practice, however, these successes may be viewed as very limited. But it can be said to have had an impact on the fight against this scourge of trafficking in persons. Ghana's act, like that of most countries, comprises the 3 Ps. Most of us will be familiar with the three Ps, which is prevention, protection, and prosecution. Now, the National Plan for Action for the Elimination of Human Trafficking in Ghana has an additional, this national plan was enacted, I think it's the 2017 plan, and it has an additional P for partnership. And it does liaise with important partners like the United States and UNICEF, etc. There has been remarkable success in implementing the prevention component of the Act. The law enforcement agencies like the police and immigration officers have been trained through workshops and other seminars. There's widespread education of the citizenry countrywide on the dangers of human trafficking and how to avoid becoming a victim. The protection bit, however, poses a bit of a problem as the state lacks adequate resources to provide shelter, security, and other necessary facilities for the victims of human trafficking. Provision of these facilities is resource intensive, unlike the prevention implementation strategies, which are less expensive. Prosecution, as I've already stated, has chalked some successes. But to make a much more significant impact, cases on human trafficking ought to be given much more priority to enable expedited prosecution. In addition to this, more specialized courts, mostly dedicated to prosecution of these cases, ought to be established all over the country. The one factor mitigating against the realization of these goals is the ever-perennial problem of resources. There is, however, a strong will in Ghana to stamp out human trafficking. To use the word eradicate sounds overly optimistic, but with the provision of adequate resources, the fight against human trafficking will be won. Thank you.